if we don't have a clear strategy at that high level of like, well, what are we really trying to do here? And how is this program going to solve the problem that it was introduced to us in the first place? Well, what is that problem? Do we know enough about the problem to make sure that we're doing the right solution? And then how does that problem get solved through training and people development? And then what becomes possible for people in the organization, longer term and shorter term, when these programs are implemented? So that's a strategy. We are missing strategy in our thinking. We're missing that critical thinking first step of, well, wait a minute, before I jump into any model or assume that ROI or the Kirkpatrick or Brinkerhoff or whatever you love is the right one at all times, let's just take a step back and go, what are we doing and why? And make a hypothesis. So
whenever I start talking with clients or even potential clients, one of the first things that they ask me is, how are we going to measure this? Manager development, leadership development. It's one of those things that can be notoriously hard to identify whether or not you're moving the needle and having an impact with any given training intervention. So that's why I'm really excited for this week's guest on the Leadership Launchpad, Alaina Szlachta. Alaina has been a friend of mine for a couple of years now. She's actually been on the podcast once before, but she has a new book out, and so we wanted to have her back on. Alaina's background is on the science of measurement and how you can use data to make better decisions. In this discussion, we talk about our shared love for the book, The One Thing, and what she learned working at the organization that inspired that book, Keller Williams. Then we dive into some simple ways to think about data and measurement to give you tips on how you can start gathering data to make better decisions. A lot of this discussion is very learning and development focused, but even if you aren't in L&D, there are a lot of great lessons here because Alaina's approach to measurement and evaluation is really universal. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind you that if you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you are already subscribed, then I humbly ask you that you share this show with at least one other person, because that, after all, is really how we grow. And I can't tell you how much it means to me. So with that, let's get into the discussion with Alaina Szlachta. Alaina, welcome to the Leadership Launchpad. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fabulous. I love having conversations with you. This is our second official podcast conversation.
Yes.
I couldn't be more thrilled to be having this with you today.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Yeah, you were on. We had one conversation pretty early on.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've known each other for a couple years now,
Yeah.
so it's exciting.
Yeah.
It's interesting though. The last time we met, so we met up in person just a couple weeks ago as of this recording, and while you were presenting, I learned that we have a shared love of the book, The One Thing.
Yeah.
What is that book, and why do you like it?
Okay, so I plug The One Thing all the time. In fact, I use it in some of my own approach to measurement, which I know we'll talk about shortly. But The One Thing, it has this concept that I think about in my personal life and as a business owner, as a measurement professional. What's the one thing? I think about it in the domino effect. And in the book, they have, I think even the front cover has this like series of cartoonish, really well done graphics of like knocking dominoes over. So, like, if there was one domino we could knock over that would make everything else easier or no longer necessary, what is that domino? And I think that way of thinking is so smart, and it applies to everything we could do. And I use it all the time. So in that conference presentation at Core 4, I talked about that in my workshop about what's that domino for us. And I use it in different contexts. And of course, in that session, it was, if measurement is so difficult, what's the one thing that we could do, that domino we could knock over that makes measurement easier and eliminates the things that make it hard? So that's how I talked about that in our conference context.
Yeah, it's you're right though that it does apply to so many contexts for managers and business owners and everything. And I do think recently I heard an interesting take on it where it was kind of like, if you don't know your one thing, then your one thing is figuring out your one thing. It's like it's really that important, because it's just so easy to get so
Mhm.
distracted with all these different things to do, especially if you're the one in charge and you're the one who's
Yeah.
supposed to be kind of setting those priorities.
Mhm.
You, even though you worked for a little bit at Keller Williams, which is
Yeah.
kind of where the book comes from. I don't know
Not kind of. It
what
is
it
exactly
is.
where the book comes
Fair.
from. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So what was your experience like there? And was there anything that you learned or kind of took away from that time?
Yeah, so there's two things that I learned at Keller Williams, one good and one not so good. And there's another thing about Keller Williams I think isn't very well known that makes them what they are today. And I'd love to share that as a way of
Yeah,
launching into our measurement conversation. So, the two
yeah.
things about them that I learned during my time: one, I'll start with the good thing. One, I learned so much about being a smart real estate investor. So I had the
Mm,
privilege of
yeah,
overseeing all the curriculum development, and part of the approach that many L&D professionals use, but surely Keller Williams team members, we leaned heavily on our expert, very successful real estate agents as subject matter experts. So I got to
yeah.
interview some of the best real estate investors of the last 20 years who sort of grew
That's neat.
up and became successful inside of the Keller Williams ecosystem. And so I got to work with them, learn from them, build curriculum, be in the room while curriculum and programming was being facilitated, iterate on those programs. And so, how could I not walk away with so much incredible knowledge?
Absolutely.
And before I worked for Keller Williams, I'd already been in the real estate investing mindset. So I bought my second investment property, made plans for more, and just got smarter as an investor. And I can tell you, Matt, that fast forward, it was those investments and knowledge that equipped me to start my own business and jump into the entrepreneurship
Neat.
journey. And without that background, I wouldn't be where I am today. So I have Keller Williams
Yeah.
to really thank for that.
So the power, I think it just shows the power of kind of combining the subject matter experts with some good support of instructional
Hmm.
design to like
Hmm.
craft really good curriculums to really
Hmm.
bring deep knowledge to people who otherwise wouldn't get it. That's neat.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the benefits that I always enjoy being in the L&D sector, because, and when we work with our own clients, we get to work with the best of the best who are wanting to give
Yeah.
back their knowledge and expertise, and working alongside them just makes us better and smarter. And I love that about
Yeah.
our work. So
Yeah.
the second thing, which everyone's like, well, what's the bad one? Um, so the second thing I took away from Keller Williams, and that really opened my eyes to what I now know as a pervasive problem in corporate learning. And that is, here's the example. At the time, now that CEO is no longer at Keller Williams, but at the time I was working there, the CEO was adamant that the metric of success for
Mm.
our L&D programming was, drumroll, the NPS score.
Yes. Yes.
And
It's
being
all about
who
learner
yeah,
satisfaction.
Uh, yes, but yeah, being who I am an educational researcher, a doctor in education who has worked in many other sectors where measurement was such an important, critical part of our work because we were grant funded or because we were doing public health and the public deserved to
Yeah.
have curriculum and education that actually made a difference. And so, coming from a world not only of research and education, but also of rigorous measurement in other sectors, for my boss to say our metric of success is an NPS score, I said, "You're kidding. Like, you got to be kidding me." And my boss like was straight faced, like, how could I, push back against
Yeah.
that? And I said, "Well, where does that directive come from? Because that's like one of the least useful metrics
Yeah.
of all the things we
Yeah.
could be measuring in terms of the effectiveness of our programs." And my boss said it comes from the CEO and he's not willing to budge. And I said, but can't we measure other things? And they're like, yeah, well, but we're not going to give you any resources to do anything like that.
Sure.
So
Sure.
there I was stuck in what we know as level one reaction metrics that aren't going to help us improve the programs, or nor are they
Yeah.
going to help us tell any kind of story of actual behavior change and impact, because that's just not how that works. But what I
Yeah.
was introduced to at that time was something I had never been introduced to before. And it was the perception that comes from some senior leaders in organizations of what learning
Hmm.
is and how we should measure
Yeah.
it. What's the
Yeah.
value of learning, and how we then track and monitor that value. And I hate to say it, but at that time, Keller Williams had it wrong. And I think we could have been doing something so much greater than we could have. Now, that was so many years ago. And I only know that it would probably be better, different leadership, different directives. I'm sure that the team is experiencing something completely different than what I experienced. But my takeaway was that the perception and the directives of senior stakeholders are often the thing that determines our measures of success, rightly
Yeah.
or wrongly.
Yeah.
And we can be stuck in boxes that we can't
Yeah.
easily move out of, even though we know we can do better and should be doing better in different things.
Yeah.
We don't, because we don't have the partnership and support of senior leaders. And so that was the very first time in my career I had experienced that. And every other place that I had been, I was the person who guided our measurement approach and helped us to incrementally improve all the time. And not having that power, really, or authority,
Yeah.
or even respect to question and make suggestions, was a real wake up call for me. And turns out a
Yeah.
lot of people in our industry feel that every single day.
Absolutely, and I mean, I always say that I think it's a lot of it stems from the fact that the common denominator that everyone has experienced regarding quote unquote training is formal education, and they just
Mhm.
they just transpose the two as one and the same. And so, since everybody's experienced that, that's kind of where the expectation sits. And there's just not,
Mhm.
in most education, at least early education, there's now like lots of data, but it's pretty high level. It's pretty far away from like
Mhm.
any kind of like tactical impacts on, because you're not going to see a direct impact from primary education, like on like, is somebody going to get this job versus that job, or be
Mhm.
more effective this way and that way, because that's not what you're worried about in primary education, or even in like a liberal arts education. That's not really what you're worried about. You're worried about other things. And so when you take that idea into the corporate setting, it just leaves people at pretty big disadvantage in terms of what they're
Yeah.
thinking this is all about. I
Mhm.
think I did you have one more thing, or was that kind of the lead in? Because I think it leads in really well to this idea of we had briefly talked about before, of kind of definitions around some of this stuff, measurement, data, and
Mhm.
how it sounds like there's a lot of like kind of legacy beliefs around what this can
Mhm.
be in the corporate
Mhm.
world that keeps it
Mhm.
from really being successful.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't the thing. And there is one more
Right.
thing that I think is really
Great.
important to share about Keller Williams. And it does lead us into some
Great.
definitions. In fact, it gives us an
Perfect.
example that makes a definition easier and more intuitive to understand.
Perfect.
So, in my book that I have coming out, Measurement and Evaluation on a Shoestring, one of the chapters is devoted to data literacy. And in my career, and in all the theories and things I've read and all the thought leadership that I've been exposed to, I believe that the one thing we could do differently as an industry, and that even expands into marketing and customer success. Like, I don't believe this is just an L&D thing, that if we developed more data literacy, it would be that domino that would, should we knock that over, everything else becomes easier and the obstacles may be eliminated. And so Keller
Mm,
Williams is an organization I feature in my chapter on data literacy, because I wanted people to have examples of like, well, what does it mean that an organization is using data and data literate principles in everyday practice? And then so what? What's the benefit of doing that?
yeah.
So
Yeah.
Matt, you mentioned before we hit the record button that one of the stories you'd heard about Keller Williams is some of their success is due to their training that comes from Gary Keller. And yes, that is absolutely true. But what's lesser known is that what has driven Keller Williams' success are their data systems and their ways in
Okay.
which they kept data on every single transaction from the moment their doors
Mm,
opened back in the 80s, before we had really robust computer and technology systems
hmm.
to assist us. And as Keller Williams grew, and so here's the thing that I think is not talked about enough. Oftentimes, as businesses grow and expand, they don't keep an eye on their systems. They let their systems go awry, and then eventually
Yeah.
they take a look back and go, "Oh crap, we should have probably done that differently." And then they have to invest time, energy, and resources to go fix it. Well, Keller Williams, from the moment they opened their doors all the way up to today, and all the global franchises they have kept the same system. Now, not the same system in the sense of like their technology has evolved, but they have
Yeah.
required that every single franchise, all the data on every single agent, when they join, how many leads they have, how many doors they've knocked on, all the way to the transactions that they've done and how much the commission was, every single data point. Plus, you can imagine demographic details on the agents has been documented since the days of opening. And that huge amount of data has compounded to become something that allows Keller Williams to be really, really intentional with where they go in the market, who they go after, how
Yeah.
they support people, and just being the number one, whether that's in agent count or number of homes sold or the amount of commission or the volume that they do. So they've been number one. And the reason for that is their very intentional use of data and making it such that as they grew, everybody used the same system so that that data could
Mm,
become so powerful as they made choices. Well, now, fast forward, they've got their own CRM. All the data now is
yeah.
harnessed in a way more meaningful way. And they're making choices all the time with what markets do they expand into? When do they switch out leadership? How do they support these people? Because everybody's making money on agents closing deals. So, how can they be more intentional with doing that? So, that's data and data literacy in its finest. It's being aware of the importance of data and what using information and insights can do to help us make smart choices to take next steps in growth and optimization and fixing problems. And without that kind of robust data, it's very difficult to make some of those decisions in a smart way. Sometimes our decisions are risky. And if we have to
Yeah.
make a big risky decision, using good data helps sometimes eliminate the risk or at least reduce the risk of the decision and investments that we make in things of that nature for the business. So I love Keller Williams for being a role model in what's possible when we think really intentionally about how we use data, and not only how we use it, but like the systems we use and why it's important,
Yeah.
and getting everybody enrolled and onboarded into like why that system is important. So yeah, I think that
Hmm.
is just really brilliant.
Interesting. So, how does that clash with what you see in a lot of places, where there isn't that same understanding or rigor of what data is or can do for you?
It's really simple. It's like being blind.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why
And
I
is
love
that
being mhm.
no, go ahead.
So why I love being a researcher, and this is how I think of myself. So, my training and my doctorate degree program trained me how to think. I believe any higher education we do teaches us how to think or how to think differently. And for
Yeah,
me, I walked
absolutely.
away forever changed in that I will always look at the world with that research, that curiosity, that investigative mindset. And I'm always going to want to look for good evidence and data to help me make choices because that's what researchers do. And so, with good data, we can see things that we could never see before. And whether we
Hmm.
collect data or we just analyze it in a new way, it gives us visibility into really important things. And so without the data, and heaven forbid, sometimes even the data we have isn't the right data or good data, and I'm happy to talk about what makes it good. But without that, we can be making bad decisions. We can't back our ideas around why should we make these changes. If I had some really good data and presented it to the CEO all those years ago, back to Keller Williams, about, hey, here's why the NPS score isn't the best metric, and if we decided to use these different metrics, what it could do for the business, maybe if I
Yeah.
had approached it that way, things would have looked different. But I was new at the time and didn't feel confident having that conversation with my boss or the CEO. But yeah, data helps us see things that we can't or couldn't see before.
Yeah, everything you're saying, it really reminds me of Annie Duke. Do you know who Annie Duke is?
I do
She's
not.
she's a professional poker player, but she's also, I forget if she was trained as an economist or what exactly she was trained in, but she has a one of her books is called Thinking in Bets, and a
Hmm.
lot of it has to do with kind of the importance of data and the idea of like you can't base your decisions purely on the outcome of that one decision. You can
Mm-hmm.
make the right decision but have the wrong outcome, and it's just
Mm-hmm.
kind of, it could just be dumb luck. And the example that she uses that's really common, that's close to my heart, is from the Super Bowl where the Seahawks were playing the Patriots, and it's just like one of the best Super Bowls ever. Comes down to the wire, the very last play of the game, where the Seahawks are right on the line to score a touchdown, and everybody thinks they're going to go to their running back because he's like one of the best running backs, and they're just going to shoot it right in, and instead they go for a passing play that gets intercepted, and
Mm.
everybody's just like, Pete Carroll, you're the worst football coach ever. Why would you ever do this? When if you look at the data of situations like that play, an interception
Mm.
in that, it's like there's like a four and a
So
half percent
unlikely.
chance.
Yeah.
It's such an unlikely thing to happen. So it was probably the right decision based on the
Mm-hmm.
data. It just happened to have the wrong outcome this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can never know that unless you have all that data.
Yeah.
So I love, thank you for kind of that walkthrough of time, kind of your time in Keller Williams, but then even more importantly, your time before that and all of your experiences of research, because I think you're right. It's really data in, especially in the corporate learning world, is very boxed in. And
Yeah.
so having that deep background of allows you, I think, that different way to look at it, because the impact that it can have. And I
Mm-hmm.
have to believe, that's kind of what led to your formulation of how, measurement and evaluation can work. In the learning world, the thing that everybody goes back to is kind of the Kirkpatrick levels, or it's like level 1, 2, 3, 4. There's some very basic metrics, but your system, I think, is A, simpler, and B, much more broadly applicable. I don't think it's just applicable to kind of like a learning sense.
Right.
I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through your process or your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I want to start by saying I don't believe any measurement model, whether it's an L&D specific model like the Kirkpatrick model or the ROI methodology or the LTEM framework or Brinkerhoff success case method. There's many of them. There's so many more that we don't know. None of those models are wrong. And I'm not going to
Sure.
stand up here
Yes.
and say,
Yeah.
you should use this always forever because it's the best model. I think every model has its place and its value. And the challenge for us, and I think this is human nature coming in a little bit, as humans, we want the easy button.
Yeah.
And in
Give
some
me the
ways,
answer. Just tell me the right
yeah,
answer,
yeah,
Alaina.
yeah. Uh, in some ways, it's the human nature of wanting to do what's easier versus what's right. And so to
Mm,
be using one model to evaluate, measure, monitor, tell the story of success for every single one of your learning programs, now that's wrong because it
yeah.
at one model, and this is my expert opinion, others will disagree with me, and that's okay. We could debate this, and I'm happy to. But I don't believe that there's one model that is appropriate and ultimately useful Like we want to use a model to measure and monitor our effectiveness based upon what our goals and context and resources are. And so there's a little bit of a dance that we have to do. Now, there may be one model that works best for your organization almost all the time, but not every time. And trying to use
Yeah.
the same model in every context, every program, every time might make things more difficult than they need to be. So for me, before I jump into a model, because I think the problem is the models give us tactics, actions,
Yeah.
stepwise strategies. These are things that get us right into action, and that's great. And that's why they're useful. The problem is if we don't have a clear strategy at that high level of like, well, what are we really trying to do here? And how is this program going to solve the problem that it was introduced to us in the first place? Well, what is that problem? Do we know enough about the problem to make sure that we're doing the right solution? And then how does that problem get solved through training and people development? And then what becomes possible for people in the organization, longer term and shorter term, when these programs are implemented. So that's a strategy. We are missing strategy in our thinking. We're missing that critical thinking first step of, well, wait a minute, before I jump into any model or assume that ROI or the Kirkpatrick or Brinkerhoff or whatever you love is the right one at all times, let's just take a step back and go, what are we doing and why? And make a hypothesis. So, being
Yeah.
the researcher that I am, I always hypothesize, okay, well, what are we doing here? If people participate in our programs and they complete that, well, how does that develop them? And what does that look like? And what is that development going to do immediately in the immediate term? What becomes possible for the organization, for our department, whatever? And then what becomes possible longer term because that shorter term thing took place. This is a hypothesis that helps narrow us. And I think the benefit of it is we have a lot of scrap learning. There's data out there that
Yeah.
says that 70 to 80% of learning is wasted. Time is wasted, money is wasted,
Yeah.
and we don't want to do that. Ideally, we are helping the business manage its resources and making smart choices about the length, the focus, and the supports that we do in our programming. So, your hypothesis will really help to narrow that down and try to eliminate some of those unnecessary things from the get go because your hypothesis is what keeps you sort of accountable. The other piece about that is the hypothesis can help you then figure out, well, what data should we be looking to,
Yeah.
test if our hypothesis is accurate or not. And then you can figure
Yeah.
out, well, model would help me to collect the data, to create assessments or whatever, to then be able to test the hypothesis in time. So I'm a strategic thinker, and I believe we just need more big strategic ideas before we dive into our measurement models that will just make things a lot easier.
There's a lot to unpack there that I really, really like. One, I think just at a I love how one of the first things that you talk about is the importance of taking into account a lot of other factors, such as the resources that you have. Because oftentimes, we might say, like, okay, like, yes, this would be amazing, but is it real? Like, I mean, in my world of, leadership development and really try, there's lots of big picture changes that we would love to make in an organization based on it, but in some cases you could like write a thesis around
Mm-hmm.
trying to prove some of these longer term outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so to just say, okay, like, that's unrealistic, let's try to look at something else. And then I
Mm-hmm.
think, kind of to your model and kind of how you think about it, if I could use slightly different words, the what I took away from it, and correct me if I'm mishearing this, it's almost like, okay, what are we trying to achieve with this decision? Or what are we trying to achieve with this intervention?
Mm-hmm.
What are the leading indicators that that's happening? And what are the lagging indicators that that's happening? And then you can
Mm-hmm.
go figure out, okay, how do we measure that stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that kind of right? Right framing?
It's actually simpler than that.
Excellent.
So, there is a lot of jargon and terminology like formative
Sure.
assessments versus summative assessments, leading indicators, lagging indicators. And I think, like, cool, but like it's actually simpler than that. Let's break it down to just
Yeah.
data artifacts. Like they might be
Yeah.
leading indicators, they might be lagging indicators, but the best thing that we can do for ourselves, and I talk about this in my book too, is like once you've got your hypothesis loosely mapped out, there's a lot of people that talk about the chain of evidence between a learning program and
Mm.
longer term outcomes. Once you've got that loosely outlined, the most important question we can ask ourselves is what data artifacts will help us to test and prove our hypothesis, and then to brainstorm all the possible things. Because there's not just going to be one data artifact, there's likely going to be
Mm.
20. We're limited only by our strategic, creative thinking. And then we ask ourselves, of all these data artifacts, what is the most realistic for us to be utilizing? So, screw leading and lagging indicators, not literally, those are important things to think about. But for those of us who just need to start measuring more and have a little more integrity with our measurement approach, we need to figure out what's the best data for us to be collecting to test that hypothesis, but then what's realistic. And here's an example. I don't think we should be writing our own assessments because we are not
Mm.
experts in writing assessments. And
Mm.
if we want good quality data to help us test and prove if growth took place, especially if that growth is in performance, we shouldn't be writing assessments. We should be buying assessments that have been validated and are reliable by companies for whom, like, that's what they do for a living. Like, if you want really good
Mm.
data, we need to take into account what creates good data, and poor assessments, thoughtless assessments, not to say that us in the industry are going to be thoughtless, we'll probably do the best that we can, but we are not experts in writing assessments that
Yeah.
are going to give us
Yeah.
good data. And if that's the
Yeah.
primary method in which we are collecting data on knowledge and performance changes, we're going to have so much bias in that that it's not going to be a good indicator if we are moving in the right direction. So that
Yeah.
lens of what's realistic, but also has the most integrity. In some cases, that's where you make smart choices in bringing in external vendors to partner with you to give you some assessments. Other times, like I use ChatGPT and Claude. I think performance assessments are super powerful. And like, let's be honest, we want to change behavior with most of our programs. So, like, help write good rubrics for evaluating performance using artificial intelligence, because it can really help you to, with the right prompts, create rubrics that are actually useful to then have everybody use the same rubric at different times in somebody's learning journey to evaluate their growth and change in that performance. So, that's one thing we can do. But
Yeah.
ultimately, what's the data artifact that's the most realistic and has the most integrity, regardless if it's formative, summative? Like, what's the most realistic for what we need right now?
Yeah, and thinking back to my time as leading internal teams in companies, like, I'm hearing everything you're saying and just thinking like, man, that just sounds like a lot of work. There's just like we don't have time to be that deliberate about things. But then of course the answer is just like, well, that means we just need to be doing less, because if we're not doing this, then we're just wasting our time, or we don't know if
Right.
our time's being used effectively. And so chances are we just need a lot fewer but more effective learning interventions, and that's
Yes.
really how we change
Yes.
things. Yeah.
Yes. That's right. Yep. A lot
Awesome.
less formal. Like, this is really,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
goes against so much of our industry, but a lot less formal education and more like in the flow of work performance support. And if you're interested in learning
Yeah.
more about that, JD Dillon wrote a fantastic book called The Modern Learning Ecosystem that I think outlines a really good plan for what is the ideal proportion of formal learning, performance support, job aids, etc. And I think it works. And
Yeah.
he knows it works because he's
Yeah.
been living and breathing it for his whole career. I think our whole
Yeah.
industry would be better served following that model.
I love it. Well, as we close, one thing I'd love to kind of finish with is, given your background and everything that you know about data and research and using it to make decisions, if there was one piece of advice, I'm kind of throwing this at you out of left field. If there was one piece of advice you had
Mm.
to help all people, whether they're leaders, learning folks, make more data-based decisions, what
Hmm.
would that piece of advice be?
Start in an environment that's a little bit low stakes, because the truth of the matter
Ooh.
is, no matter if it's working with data or if it's baking biscuits for the first time because I don't cook and baking biscuits is intimidating to me. Or,
Yeah.
driving a car, you're new to driving, like whatever it is, it's doing new things is always intimidating. So I would
Yeah.
say probably don't start testing data and data driven decision making in a high stakes thing where like your job depends on it. Do it in a space where you can learn, make mistakes. And if you do make mistakes, you can learn from them, but there's no like big risky outcome. And so I
Yeah.
would say, and I say this as many times and as many places as people will accept me saying it, because I think we need to hear it. Find areas in your personal life where you can practice using data to make smarter choices for things that matter to you. Because imagine you're the CEO of your own life. So, what are some things that are important decisions for you to make in your own life? And you want to use good evidence, trustworthy data to make the right choice. That could be, what car do I purchase next? That could be, how do I figure out how to save $1,000 a month to buy a new house? That could be a lot of things. Do we have another child? Right? So, what are some of those big, important decisions in your life that you have to make and you want to make them smartly? And how do we
Yeah.
think about good data, sources of data, unbiased data, to help us make those wise choices? And then you'll learn, because you're not going to get it right. And that only after we made a choice, this everyone's head who's listening, like, yes, I can see myself that's happened. I make a choice and I'm like, oh, if only I could have remembered, or I would have thought of doing this. Now you'll do it differently next time. So
Yeah.
pick a low stakes environment, most likely in your personal life, where it matters to you, some decision, it's important, it's big, and you want to use data. And then we go through that data literacy lens, which is, what data do I need? Where do I get it? How do I make sure it's trustworthy? How do I then look for insights from that data? What do the insights tell me? What choice am I going to make? Make the choice and then look back and go,
Yeah.
how would I change my sources of data based upon the outcome of that results, et cetera, et cetera.
I love it. Finding ways to exercise that muscle,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not just going to happen right away.
Mm-hmm.
That's great advice. Awesome. Well, Alaina, it's always great talking to you.
Yeah.
There's so much great stuff in here. I think just that people can use in all aspects of their life. Can as we finished. So as always, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah.
And I look forward to the next time we can chat.
Yeah. Well, and if folks are interested in following more insights, methodologies, thought leadership, or just thinking differently about measurement, there's two places that you can go for that. One is more hands on. We have a Monday meetup, it's at 12 Eastern. It's free. It's for any nerd who wants to geek out and improve their measurement and experience and thinking working with data. And then I have a newsletter. It's a more of an e-publication. It comes out every weekend for people just to think differently and invite inspiration around working with data and measurement. And that is on Substack. You can get both of those things at dralaina.com/MME for Measurement Made Easy.
Excellent. And we'll link to that in the show notes. And then, of course, I almost forgot. When does your book come out? What's the date again?
Not often, or not soon enough. No, it comes out November 26th, which is, I don't know if it's
Great.
good or bad. It's the week of Thanksgiving. So maybe everybody is going to be like hungry and tired and just like want to kick their feet up and read a new book. So that could be great. Or everybody will
Yeah.
forget about it because they're having too much fun with their families. So we shall see. But nonetheless,
But
November
it's
26th is the release date.
and it's just in time to get on everybody's Christmas list. So,
Yeah.
you can
I
swing
do
it in that
think
way.
that's one of the bonus pieces
Yeah,
about that. Yeah.
exactly. Awesome. Well, great chatting with you. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.